Hey guys, Endless here, welcome back to the channel. This is part 4 of What If Deku is Cursed Speech. Also check out the other videos on my playlists. But I hope you guys enjoyed. The green-haired boy sighed and walked inside his classroom. Izuku glanced at the blonde behind him and just continued towards his seat. But before the duo were able to sit down, Aizawa walked in and glared at the two boys. Said boys tensed and quickly sat down. Aizawa walked in front of the podium and stared at the class with a critical gaze. I saw the footage of the battle trials. And All Might's report, as he said that Aizawa activated his quirk and glared at Izuku and Bakugo. However, he stopped his glare and spoke out loud. You guys all have to do something pretty important. Everyone in the class stared at him, waiting in anticipation, some even thinking if this is hero-related or something. Aizawa stood quiet for another second, gazing their looks, and spoke. You all have to choose class representatives. After hearing this, the class shouted, with everyone saying to pick me as rep. Even Bakugo shouted, I am the only one strong enough for class rep. However, he heard a cough behind him and glared at the green-haired boy. Said boy just raised a brow and asked, Mustard leaf? Katsuki was about to say something, but that's when he heard the little pervert shout, vote for me if you want to see the girls in short skirts. However, the blonde threw his book at the back of the purple-haired boy's head and growled, not a chance, midget. Said midget was about to yell at whoever threw the book at him, but noticed it was Bakugo who threw it at him. Laughing nervously, he muttered, I was just kidding. But as he said this, Mineta noticed all of the girls' killing intent directed at him. He just sat down and stood quiet. When he had made that declaration, the purple-haired boy had stood up on his desk. After hearing the class yelling out of control, Tenya spoke up to their sensei, does it matter how we choose the class reps? The black-haired man, who was already halfway into his cocoon, just shrugged, do it however you want. And with that he quickly zipped up his sleeping bag and fell to the floor. Tenya nodded and shouted to get everyone's attention, why don't we put this to a vote to see who deserves the position? That's when Tsuyu remarked, your hand is still raised up. After hearing this, the blue-haired boy quickly put his hand down and looked sheepish. He coughed into his fist and spoke, anyway, I will pass around a small paper and everyone write a name on it to who you want to be class rep. He glanced at his class and noticed how Kaminari looked at him with skepticism. Not a moment later he spoke his mind. Wouldn't we just vote for ourselves, he questioned. Tenya pondered about that moment and replied, well, whoever gets more than one vote earned the position. After hearing that, everyone nodded and Tenya passed the small papers around. Momo had helped him, her being the one that made the small papers. Anyways, 5 minutes later Tenya and Momo picked up the papers and wrote on the board the names that had more than one vote. After he was done writing, he looked at the board and moved to the side so the class could see. Izuku Midoriya, 4 votes. Katsuki Bakugo, 3 votes. Momo Yaoyorozu, 2 votes. Tenya Lita, 2 votes. Everyone stared at the board in shock, not knowing how it would be like to have a mute and a crazy blonde as reps. Aizawa woke up after everyone went silent. He got out of his sleeping bag and stared at the class, then at the board. Then at the class again and muttered, this will be either really interesting or a bad idea. However, he shrugged and called the 2 problem brats over, said boys were shocked they had people vote for them. Unknown to the 2 boys, both of them had voted for each other. Izuku thought Katsuki could be a good leader and can back up anyone. And Katsuki thought Izuku would be a better class rep than him, so he had wrote his name. Though he wouldn't admit it to anyone. Either way, the 2 boys stood in front of the class and everyone was quiet till Kirishima shouted, that's manly. And that's when the bell rang for lunch. Izuku muttered, mustard leaf. But Bakugo heard him. The blonde glared at him as they were walking out of the class and got said boy's attention. You know, give it a try, maybe you will be good at it. The green-haired boy looked at him confused, but that's when something jumped on his back. Izuku tensed, but quickly relaxed once he heard his girlfriend's giggle. Said girl leaned in and kissed him on the side of his cheek, then quickly got off of him. Izuku turned around and smiled at Yui. Said girl noticed he wasn't wearing a mask but a black scarf. Yui grabbed his hand and waved at Bakugo, who waved back. She noticed the red head besides the blonde and smiled at Kirishima. Said boy looked at Bakugo confused, then back at the black-haired girl. Who are you if you don't mind me asking? She just smiled and grabbed onto Izuku's arm, who had a small blush on his cheeks. I'm Izuku's girlfriend, she said with a soft smile. Kirishima just nodded and gave a thumbs up to Izuku, who looked at him with a raised eyebrow. But the four of them made their way to the lunch area, with Izuku telling Yui that he became class rep. After hearing this, Yui was surprised a bit but smiled at him nonetheless. I think you'll do great, Izu. Said boy smiled and nodded at her. Then the four got their food from lunch rush and looked around for a table. Katsuki spotted one and told the other three to follow, who did so. But as they were walking, Katsuki noticed a blonde-haired boy trying to trip Izuku, who wasn't paying attention. Said boy's attention was on his girlfriend, who was telling him about how her morning went. Bakugo growled and handed Kirishima his food plate, who was standing right beside him. He was about to ask what was up when he noticed the student trying to trip Midoriya. But as Izuku walked closer to the other blonde, Katsuki shouted at him, "Boy, you better move that leg or it might snap." The boy, being surprised that someone had saw him, quickly moved his leg back, and Izuku narrowed his eyes at the kid. Said boy laughed nervously and noticed how everyone was staring at him. He then looked over at Yui and shouted, "Why are you hanging around class 1A losers? They are nothing more than..." But he didn't get to finish as everyone could hear a smack. Yui glared at the blonde-haired boy and shouted angrily, "Because one of those people in class 1A is my boyfriend." Monoma stared at her in shock. He didn't think the quiet girl in class could get this angry. In class she usually has a cold face and not really showing any emotion. He was about to shout back, but that's when chop! Monoma fell down towards the ground and Kendo caught him. She waved at Izuku and spoke to them. Sorry about him, he has an inferiority complex. She then walked away while giving Yui a thumbs up. Who was now beet red. She noticed how Izuku was staring at her in shock. Plus everyone else in the cafeteria. But Katsuki was just smirking towards her, with him thinking, yep, she is definitely good for him. The green-haired boy then walked towards his girlfriend, and handed her plate back. Yui had given it to him so she can smack Monoma. Once she grabbed at Izuku, took her other hand with his own and led her to a table. With Bakugo following after getting his own plate back from Kirishima. Said boy looked at Bakugo in a new light. He noticed how the blonde was getting ready to pounce to stop Monoma from tripping his friend. If he hadn't stopped when Bakugo shouted, Kirishima knew that Katsuki probably would have started a fight in front of everyone. Anyways, they all sat at a table in the corner. Yui was trying to feed Izuku, but said boy kept shaking his head in the negative, with his arms in a cross. But as he looked at Bakugo, who got his attention, that's when the black-haired girl moved the spoon into the green-haired boy's mouth. Said boy stared at her and just chewed silently with a blush, while Yui just raised her hands up in victory. Bakugo and Kirishima, who were watching the two, just laughed at Izuku's red face. But as they were laughing, that's when sirens had started to go off in the cafeteria. Both of the boys stopped laughing and looked around at the panicking students. However, Yui had got scared from the sirens and jumped on Izuku, which ended up with both of them falling towards the ground. Katsuki and Kirishima looked down at the duo and started laughing again, all the while pointing a finger at them. However, they soon stopped once Yui pointed her spoon at them menacingly with a glare. But that soon stopped once she realized what she was sitting on top of. She looked down and her face went beet red again. Yui was sitting on top of Izuku, who was blushing as well. Quickly getting up, she helped the green-haired boy up, and that's when Katsuki looked outside and noticed it was just reporters. Oi Izuku, come over here. Said boy walked over and looked outside and noticed it wasn't a villain attack, just the press. However, once he looked back at his friend, he gulped when he saw his face. Katsuki just grinned and pounced once he saw him trying to hide behind Yui, quickly grabbing his shoulder. The blonde launched himself towards the exit with an explosion, with Izuku following right after. Incidentally, Bakugo wondered what had hit him when he was halfway through the hallway. He just shrugged and continued on and stopped in front of the exit sign, still levitating due to his explosions. Unknown to the blonde, Tenya was nursing his head from the fall. He had Achiko use her quirk on him, but as he was making his way to the exit, a shoe had hit him on top of the head and sent him towards the ground. But once Izuku noticed they stopped, he quickly muttered, "Foothold," and put one under him and the blonde. He then shouted, "Quiet." After hearing this, everyone went quiet and stared at the two who were just standing on air. Once Katsuki saw that everyone was looking at them, he shouted, "Just look outside, you extras, it's only the press." Some people looked outside while others had a sweat drop, with them thinking, did he just call us extras? Bakugo then shouted, "Now just go back to class and do it at a normal pace." Izuku just muttered, "Caviar," and jumped down along with the ash blonde. Everyone then made it back to their class, and Aizawa praised the two brats with an annoyed face, because said brats were giving him smug looks. Aizawa coughed into his hand and dismissed the class, telling them tomorrow they're going to a field trip. The next day, Izuku had told his mother about the field trip and was about to walk out of the door when Inko stopped him. She gave him a hug and spoke, "Just be careful." Izuku nodded and gave her a smile. The green-haired boy walked away and waved over his shoulder. As he walked away, Inko felt something bad was going to happen today. Once he reached the end of his block, Izuku looked up ahead and saw Katsuki waiting for him with his bag over the blonde's shoulder. When the blonde noticed Izuku, he smirked and waited for the green-haired boy to walk up to him. Once Izuku was in front of him, Bakugo grinned and brought his fist up. "You excited for today?" The green-haired boy smiled and bumped his fist against the blonde's. "Salmon." Katsuki nodded and turned around, making his way to the train station with Izuku by his side. Now we skip to when they got to class. As they entered, they noticed their classmates grabbing their costumes on the side. They were about to go grab theirs, but Kirishima shouted, "I got both of your costumes, they're over here." Izuku and Katsuki walked over to the redhead and grabbed their briefcases. The three chatted for a bit, but after 2 minutes the rest of the class had already grabbed their costumes and Aizawa walked in. He walked over to the front podium and spoke, "We are going to the U.S.J, go get changed and meet me out front in 10 minutes. There's a bus waiting for us," and with that he left outside. Izuku walked out with Katsuki, but that's when the green-haired boy saw Yui about to enter her class. Said girl turned around and noticed Izuku. She waved and said, "I'll see you later." Izuku nodded and he quickly ran towards the changing room with the blonde following shortly after. 5 minutes later, Izuku and Katsuki were one of the first ones out of the changing room. They both made their way towards the bus in a comfortable silence. Once the two were in front of the school, they noticed their teacher waiting in front of said bus. He glanced at his phone and back at the two boys. "You guys changed into your hero costumes quick?" Katsuki nodded. "Yeah, Izuku over here wanted to see the inside of the bus to see if everyone should be paired or not." Aizawa just shook his head. "No, the seats are different so they can just enter however they want." He then shrugged his shoulders. Izuku nodded and waited for the rest of the class to arrive. Once they did, Izuku noticed Lita trying to make everyone go in a straight line, but Katsuki just shook his head at the blue-haired boy. Tenya raised an eyebrow, but complied with the vice rep anyway. When they entered inside, Tenya gave a grateful nod to Katsuki, who just grunted and sat next to Izuku. They were sitting in the middle of the bus and Izuku was looking out of the window, wondering how this will go. He glanced at the blonde at his side and noticed the other students were talking with one another. Izuku touched the marking on his face and looked down for a bit. He just sighed and turned his gaze towards the window once again. Bakugo noticed this on the corner of his eye and thought if there's a device to let him talk normally. But that's when someone in the class asked, "Who has the strongest quirk out of all of the first years?" Someone shouted Todoroki might have the strongest quirk. But that's when Kirishima spoke up, "Nah, Bakugo and Midoriya have the strongest." Someone was about to interject, but that's when Katsuki spoke out loud, "You know, having the strongest quirk won't matter against someone with a versatile quirk." Everyone stared at him in shock. They just thought he would have agreed. He then continued, "Let's say if you have a weak quirk or a cursed one." As he said this, the blonde glanced at Izuku, who pulled his collar up a bit higher. "It doesn't matter, it's how you train your quirk. Then those will be the strongest," he said with a big grin. That's when Tsuyu spoke up, looking at Izuku. "So class rep, why do you barely talk?" she asked curiously. Izuku looked at her and tilted his head. Mustard leaf? This time Suya raised an eyebrow, but that's when Katsuki spoke for Izuku. His quirk doesn't allow him to speak normally, that's why he talks in rice recipes. So how can you understand him? Momo asked. Katsuki glanced at the girl and shrugged, I've been his friend for most of my life, so I guess I'm just able to. It isn't that hard really, his girlfriend started to understand him pretty quick. Hearing this, Izuku blushed a bit and glared at Katsuki, who just smirked at the glare. Mina was about to shout something, but that's when Aizawa cut them all off. Quiet, we are here, get out of the bus. Izuku followed the blonde out of the bus, but felt that something was off. Him being able to tell due to his instincts. The green-haired boy looked at Bakugo and saw that he was tense as well. The blonde looked at Izuku and nodded, the two followed after their teacher wanting to tell him. But as they reached him, the door of the facility opened and the Pro Hero 13 appeared. Izuku nudged Bakugo and the blonde, getting the hint, shouted Aizawa-sensei. Said teacher turned around and raised a brow, Katsuki hasn't called him sensei, only Hobo or Aizawa. Anyways, Bakugo spoke as they walked inside, I think something bad is going to happen. Aizawa nodded, he got the same feeling as well. We should be able to handle it, we have two pro heroes here after all. As they were talking, 13 was explaining about the facility and all of the landscapes. All the while Izuku was looking around, and as he was looking, the green-haired boy noticed a black portal in the center of the U.S.J. Izuku then rushed towards Bakugo and Aizawa and pointed down at the portals, once he was next to them. Katsuki, being curious, glances down and noticed about 100 villains walking out of the portals and giving the students a grin. Izuku noticed in the back 3 figures were watching on. The green-haired boy noticed the black portal shape next to the guy with the weird hands all over his body and face. So he was the one that can teleport people, Izuku thought. As he was analyzing them, Shigaraki was yelling at the students, asking for all might. Aizawa, having enough of the rambling, was about to jump down. But that's when Izuku put a hand on his shoulder. He then looked over at Bakugo while moving his collar to the side. Katsuki, seeing this, shouted at everyone to cover their ears. Once the class heard that, they quickly covered them with their hands. When Izuku saw this, he stared at the villains below and shouted, "Go to sleep." Once they heard the shout, about 30% of them fell to the ground unconscious, with the remaining ones looking at them in surprise. Shigaraki looked at the green-haired boy and grinned, "So you're the one Master told me about." He looked over at Kurogiri and spoke in a whisper, "Send the green-haired one into the middle of the crowd of villains." The Shadow Man nodded and quickly teleported away. Izuku, feeling something was about to happen, looked down and noticed the portal below him. He jumped up and shouted, "Foot dash!" But before he could finish, the shadow mass that was below him had quickly surrounded the green-haired boy and teleported him away. Bakugo, seeing this, tried to grab Izuku's arm but wasn't fast enough. Looking down towards the center, there he saw the green-haired boy down below next to all of the villains. Without a second thought, Katsuki launched an explosion and propelled himself at high speeds towards his friend. Aizawa, seeing this, shouts after him to come back. However, in response, Bakugo shouted back, "Fuck off, I'm not abandoning him." The pro hero was just stunned at those words for a moment. When Kirishima saw Bakugo rush to Midoriya's side, he quickly ran over to the edge of the staircase and jumped down. The redhead quickly activated his quirk as he was falling and landed with a loud boom. Aizawa, seeing this, rubbed his forehead and muttered, "They are so getting punished after this." He then turned around towards a frantic 13 and shouted, "Protect the kids, I'll bring those problem brats back." And with that, he jumped down after the trio. However, Shigaraki noticed him and looked at his Nomu. "Why don't you keep him busy? I want to see what the green-haired one can do." The Nomu, instead of replying, just rushed towards Aizawa at high speeds, who was still free falling. Seeing the bird muscle head rushing towards him, Aizawa glanced at his side and threw his scarf at the side of a tree and pulled, which sent him out of the monster's trajectory. The Nomu, however, just crash-landed onto the stairs, then dashed at Aizawa again with Izuku. Once the green-haired boy landed, Izuku noticed all of the villains turning towards him. Thinking quickly, he shouted blast away. The villains that were the closest to him got launched back toward the end of the crowd. After seeing this, some of the long-ranged villains launched their quirks at him. One guy was even shooting bullets out of his hands. Izuku, seeing all of this, shouted, "Redirect and body enhancement," all the while ignoring the blood that was slowly coming out of his mouth. All of the quirks that were launched towards him were directed towards other villains, which ended up knocking some of them out. Izuku had used this as a distraction and dashed away, going towards the staircase. However, as he ran away from the center, a big villain had noticed him and appeared in front of him. Izuku put his guard up once he noticed the man was readying a punch. The man launched said punch towards Izuku, who had blocked, but got sent flying back towards the crowd of villains. Izuku growled and was able to catch himself. Once he landed onto the ground, Izuku tried to reach for his pouch to drink his cough syrup. But some villains had noticed this and started to launch their quirks at the green-haired boy once again. Izuku swore in his mind and dodged all of the attacks and redirected them to other villains, making sure to not redirect them at any vital spots. But anyways, as our protagonist was fighting, Kurojiri had teleported the students and incapacitated the Pro Hero 13. He had moved all of the students into different parts of the U.S.J. to make sure no one was able to get away. However, some students were able to dodge and was trying to reach the exit. But back with Izuku, he had dodged a punch that shattered the ground, then quickly spun and launched a roundhouse kick in retaliation to the man's head, which sent the villain into a group of 5 others. Izuku tried to reach for his pouch once again, but the villain that had launched him back into the center was now behind the green-haired boy and was about to launch a punch towards Izuku. Said boy turned around and thought, "I won't make it in time." That attack he sent towards the villains at the start had drained him a bit. However, just as the fist got closer to the green-haired boy's face, Izuku heard a shout that was coming towards them. "DIEE." And with that, Katsuki launched an explosion that sent the big guy into a group of 10, which knocked them all out due to the man's size. Izuku smiled as he saw his friend land right beside him. Said blonde landed and stood up. He looked at Izuku and smirked. "What, did you really think I'd leave you to have fun all by yourself?" Izuku just shook his head in the negative, but as they were talking, a certain redhead was bulldozing through the crowd of villains, going towards his 2 friends. One villain shot his quirk at Kirishima, but it just bounced off him like nothing happened. When the villain saw this, he was shocked. "That shouldn't be possible, my quirk shoots bullets." Back with the 2 boys. Izuku was now drinking his cough syrup and finished his first bottle in one gulp. He glanced at Bakugo and the blonde looked back at the green-haired boy. They then looked around at the remaining villains. There were about 30 or so left. The rest were still unconscious from the first attack that the green-haired boy did. Bakugo thought for a moment and shouted towards Izuku, "Oh, I jump up and be ready to launch an attack with me." Izuku nodded and spoke foothold and jumped onto it. He then leaped onto another one, using them as stepping stones. As he was doing that, the blonde launched an explosion towards the ground, which sent him flying into the air. When Bakugo thought he was high enough, Izuku was already at his side. Katsuki shouted launch an attack towards the ground. After he said this, Katsuki put both of his hands together and the pins on his gauntlets fell off. Izuku, seeing this, looked towards the ground and spoke. "Expand, plus explode." Both of their attacks merged together and was racing towards the ground, and once it made impact, boom! The attack had shook the whole facility and sent the remaining villains flying away. Katsuki and Izuku had aimed their attack directly below them. The only thing that hit the villains was the massive shockwave. Izuku and Bakugo for their part made their way back down, with the blonde helping the green-haired boy. Once the smoke cleared, the 2 boys looked at the side where a certain redhead was standing with his arms crossed in front of him. He peeked one eye open and thought, "Oh good, I'm still alive." When Kirishima saw his 2 friends, he was about to run over towards them, but that's when Aizawa's broken body had landed in front of him. Kirishima's eyes went wide and looked at the Nomu, who was walking back towards Shigaraki. Said teacher, who was still conscious, looked over at Kirishima and shouted to get Izuku and Katsuki away from that thing. He then continued, "It's as strong as All Might." Hearing this, Shigaraki chuckled darkly. "You are right, Eraserhead." But he pointed his finger towards the two brats. "Nomu, attack them." After the Nomu heard his new order, the creature launched towards Izuku, who in response shouted, "Don't move!" But to his shock, the thing only stopped for a second, then continued towards him. Izuku jumped to the side, but as he did, the Nomu's fist flew right past the side of his body, which ended up ripping half of his sweater. The green-haired boy shouted, "Blast away," and in the same moment Katsuki jumped in the air and spun towards the Nomu. Howitzer impact. The two attacks hit the Nomu head-on, and Izuku quickly threw his sweater to the side, now just having his black combat shirt on. Katsuki stood right next to them, and both boys tensed when they heard the beast roar. Once it did, the Nomu rushed towards them again, this time double the speed it used before. Izuku was about to shout, but that's when the Nomu grabbed him by the head and threw him towards Katsuki, who was aiming an explosion. Both boys landed on the ground in a crater. Kirishima, once he saw this, tried to launch a punch towards the Nomu, but the creature just blocked it and stared at the boy. Then a second later, you can hear a loud snap. The redhead cried out in pain, now having a broken right arm. Once the Nomu snapped his arm, it launched the redhead towards the class on top of the staircase, which he too landed in a big crater. Said boy was able to survive due to hardening his whole body at the last second, but he was now unconscious due to the pain. As he was sent flying, the two boys stood up, both now being bloodied, and their shirts were torn on one side. Katsuki stared at Izuku and back at the Nomu. Both got into a stance, but that's when the creature appeared behind them. Izuku jumped back and roared, "Get twisted!" Immediately half of the Nomu's body twisted. However, just as it started, it quickly stopped and the Nomu healed. It looked as if nothing happened. Bakugo yelled, "The hell is this thing? It can regenerate from that." Izuku started to cough once again and blood started gushing out from his mouth. He had been using his quirk for a while now. Katsuki, seeing this, mumbled to himself and got into a stance and launched himself towards the Nomu, all the while yelling, "I will buy you time to recover." Shigaraki, who was in the background, was surprised at the green-haired boy's quirk, but he didn't like the drawback that came with it. Back with said boys, Izuku drank his second bottle and quickly rushed to help the blonde, who was launching high-speed punches and kicks with explosions. Once Izuku was near, he muttered, "Accelerate!" And with that, he was moving alongside Bakugo, coordinating their attacks onto the Nomu, who was having a hard time trying to hit the duo. Both of them noticed this and smirked. It was like they were fighting a wild animal. As long as they didn't get hit, they would be fine. Izuku aimed low and Katsuki aimed for the thing's head, but Izuku was starting to slow down after a while. Sure, the Nomu wasn't hitting them, but most of their hits were just dodged as well. The green-haired boy gritted his teeth and blood started to come out from his eye. He tried to launch a kick at the Nomu, but it was finally able to adapt to their movements. It grabbed Izuku's leg and slammed him towards the ground, in which he coughed out blood and left a crater. After Bakugo saw this, he got angry and launched himself towards the Nomu and sent a massive explosion towards its head. Boom! Bakugo looked at his arms and thought, "I only have one decent attack left." He then dashed over to Izuku and picked the green-haired boy up. Izuku opened his eyes after a minute and Bakugo spoke, "I have a plan, but it might not work. Do you still want to try it?" "Salmon." Bakugo grinned and spoke, "All right, once the thing comes out, I want you to empower my explosions with all of your remaining strength." Izuku just nodded and drank his last bottle and threw it to the side. As the smoke cleared, the Nomu was about to rush at the duo again, but it couldn't move. Looking down, it noticed ice was now covering its legs and now half of its body. Todoroki appeared on the side and looked at the two boys for a second. "While you both look like crap, allow me to help," and with that he was about to launch more ice towards the Nomu. In response, it raised its free arm and punched the ground that shook the surrounding area. Once it was free, Shigaraki had appeared to the side of Shoto. "Don't interfere, brat," and he launched his hand towards Todoroki's face, who, once he saw the attack, Shoto stomped his foot on the ground and a spike of ice appeared in front of the hand, blocking the attack. Shigaraki seeing this growled and was about to launch another hand forward, but Izuku appeared above him and kicked him on the side of the face towards Kirojiri. Todoroki then spoke to the two boys. I will keep this one away, go deal with the big one. He then rushed towards Shigaraki leaving the two boys. And as if on cue the Nomu appeared at the side of Bakugo and launched a punch towards him. It was about to connect, but that's when Izuku shouted, "Redirect and crumble away." Instead of hitting Bakugo, the fist hit the ground. Then the Nomu got crushed towards the ground with its legs being destroyed for now. Bakugo seeing this as their last chance launched himself into the air. He then shouted, "Izuku now." Said boy nodded and both of them saw the Nomu getting up. After seeing this, Katsuki spun down towards him again, all the while launching explosions. Izuku in response shouted, "Accelerate plus expand." Towards Bakugo. After he said that, Katsuki started to spin faster and his explosions had tripled in size. And like a blur he reached where the Nomu was and roared. Combined attack, improved howitzer cyclone. Boom! And what followed after was a massive explosion of flames that expanded towards the roof of the U.S.J. The explosion had cracked the ground and left a massive crater where the Nomu stood. Katsuki had landed onto the ground next to Izuku panting, all the while the green-haired boy tried to stop his coughing. He had put his all into powering that attack, and he was coughing up blood, some even came out from his eyes and ears. The green-haired boy is surprised that he didn't fall unconscious due to blood loss. However, once the smoke cleared, Katsuki and Izuku's eyes were wide. There in the center of the big crater, the Nomu was still alive. Said creature only had its head and torso, but it was still regenerating. Both of them had nothing left. If Izuku went any more, it would be lethal for his health. It's even bad for him right now, and Bakugo wasn't doing any better. Both of his arms were probably fractured pretty bad. But during their fight, Kirojiri had appeared next to Tamura and told him a student was able to escape 5 minutes ago. Shigaraki scratched his neck, now drawing blood. No, it wasn't supposed to be like this. He then stopped and grinned. Well, at least we will be able to kill those two brats. Master will be able to get the green one's quirk from his corpse. As he said this, the Nomu finished healing, and Shigaraki shouted, "Stop playing around. Kill the green-haired one first." After he shouted that, however, the door to the U.S.J got flown open and in walked the #1 hero, All Might. But that is the end of this part. What did you guys think of their teamwork and combined attacks? Anyways, if you enjoyed this part, let me know in the comments and leave a like for a cookie.